Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk about the emergent meta-narrative that exists in the Disney Wars. I'm talking primarily about the sequel trilogy, not the interquels, not Rogue One and Solo, but episodes 7, 8, and 9, Force Awakens, Last Jedi, Rise of the Skywalker. The meta-narrative of a fan fantasy and a rebellion against that fan fantasy, even within the framework of the fan fantasy. And this emerges for a couple of reasons. Now, before I give those reasons, let me define what I mean by fan fantasy. I'm not talking about fan fiction. I called the first movie, Force Awakens, 4 years ago in my little critique that went, kind of viral for at least the level of my channel at the time. I called it a $100 million fan fiction film. Now, I was off by $100 million for the budget, but I wasn't so off when it came to fan fiction because I recognized these things right away, these things which have actually permeated and encapsulated this entire trilogy. But a fan fantasy is something different than fan fiction. Fan fiction is when you are writing a new story that incorporates the characters and the setting of the fictional universe that you are writing within. So you write a story that's new and maybe you meet Han Solo or something. That's fan fiction. Fan fantasy, though, in this case, we are actually in the movies themselves. Rather than writing a new story that takes place in Star Wars that has the old characters, we're actually in the first Star Wars movie in Force Awakens. It has a plot direction and set pieces that are identical to the very first Star Wars movie. And so the characters that are in it just represent the author's inserts of themselves having a fantasy about being in Star Wars, not in the universe, but in the movie itself. And that's what I mean by fan fantasy. And this emerges for a couple of reasons. So the first thing is the entire trilogy, maybe not by design, but certainly by effect, is just a trip through the original trilogy just directly as far as aesthetics, set pieces, and even plot points and plot goals goes. So Force Awakens, you end up blowing up a Death Star at the end, right? You start on a desert planet, you blow up a Death Star. In the The Last Jedi, you have a ripoff of Empire Strikes Back. Aesthetically, it looks identical. It even uses the same color palettes. It has walkers, just like Empire Strikes Back. It has a salt planet instead of a snow planet. It's kind of in reverse. The set pieces aren't lined up in the same order the way that they were, say, in Force Awakens, but it's just a direct transcription of the set pieces. So the fan is really having a trip through the set pieces of the next movie. And even when you get to the third movie, the final plot goal, destroying Emperor Palpatine, that's just what it is. It's the fan fantasy of completing the return of the Jedi. Although I would say that the aesthetics and the set pieces in Rise of the Skywalker are at least somewhat original compared to the other ones. But we get from this entire idea that we're involved in some sort of fan fantasy, just going through the set pieces of the movies themselves. We also have a meta-narrative because we have two different directors. We have J.J. Abrams and we have Rian Johnson. And J.J. Abrams begins the trilogy with a strong fan fantasy. It's an imagining of himself going through the Star Wars movie. And Rian Johnson did not agree with that direction and did not like it. And so he made a movie about how bad the previous movie was and how dumb it was to have a fan fantasy, while it itself was a fan fantasy. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of an interesting movie on the meta level as a result. And then the third movie in the trilogy is about how bad the previous movie was and how bad it was to ruin that fan fantasy and to rebel against that fan fantasy. So it's a rebellion against the rebellion in order to bring things to the fans' conclusion. And the whole thing ends up being rather dreamlike as a result. It feels like it's Star Wars, but not Star Wars. It's almost like a fan is having a dream about experiencing the movies. And just like in dreams, everything is slightly off. Everything is transmuted somehow. The walkers have like gorilla hands instead of normal feet that they would have. The Snow Planet has red blood when you go over the salt because it's salt instead of snow. You have an entire planet instead of a regular Death Star. It just looks a little different. But you're still in all of these familiar places. You're on Jakku instead of Tatooine, but it looks the same. All of these things are just the fan experiencing his fantasy. And the main vehicle for this fantasy are the characters. The characters are really acting out the fantasy and the rebellion against the fantasy. So if you start with Force Awakens, what you have is a set, I think, of author inserts that really are just maybe the mind of J.J. Abrams and his writing crew imagining themselves in Star Wars. So it's no accident that as a result, it just feels like the first movie, because that's what they were really trying to imagine themselves doing. But the main character that acts as an author insert is Rey. I've gone over extensively over the last couple of years that she's a Mary Sue. I've had several pieces of viral content about her being a Mary Sue. She fits the classic definition. Not only is she perfect at everything, not only is she a paragon without any reason for her to be a paragon, she acts as an author insert. She is having the adventure that the author wishes to have in the story that the author is imagining going through. And the story they're imagining going through in Force Awakens is the very first Star Wars movie from 1977. So you see the set pieces are aligned in a way that the author insert character encounters many of the same obstacles that the original characters did back in 1977 in the 1977 movie. But each one, the solution resides in the Mary Sue rather than in some external thing to help her or in some clever way of going around the plot. So just as an example, they need to get off Jakku, which is basically Tatooine. Now, in the original movie, they had to pay Han Solo to get them off of Tatooine. They had to convince somebody else to help them get off the planet. And that brought in another character into the fold for them to, have as a friend. In this case, she gets herself off. The Millennium Falcon, the same set piece is there, but there's no Han Solo. Instead, it's her who flies it. It's her who shoots down the TIE fighters rather than Luke and Han. And while Chewie flies in space like it was in the original movie, it's her and Finn, who is also kind of an author insert character. Somebody imagining themselves getting away from the Empire. In this case, it's like the First Order, and he's completely well-adjusted, having been raised by birth by them, by the way. That's one of the signs, is that the mind is not the mind of the character, it's the mind of a person from our world, just kind of inserted into a character and acting out what they would do if they were that character. So the first obstacle, she overcomes it, but this proceeds apace, just like Luke, Han asks her to come along, hey, we could use you. So she's acting out those scenes as well. She impresses Han. Han is very impressed with her. She knows the Millennium Falcon better than Han, so she doesn't require these older characters to be able to be competent. In fact, she's already more competent than they are. She gets captured at one point, just like Leia has been captured and is put into prison to be tortured, just as Leia was tortured for information. But instead of having to be freed by the heroes like Luke Skywalker and Han, the other heroes in the story, she frees herself and just runs into the other heroes in the story, Han Solo and Finn. Finn is kind of a, he's a little bit more original character, I think, than Rey. But she frees herself and just happens to run into them on this giant planet-sized ship. So rather than having, if the person's having a fantasy about their own power, they're not going to have another person rescue them. You also have her face Kylo Ren, who represents Darth Vader, and win the battle, right? So it's like, if I were facing Darth Vader, I would beat him. It's like, rather than what the story requires, which is for her to lose initially, because she still has to power herself up in order to overcome this nemesis. And that's really one of the ways that we know that she's an author insert, and that this first movie represents the beginning of the fan's dream. The fan is having this dream of going through Star Wars. Now, once the movie gets handed off to Rian Johnson, a different kind of authorship in the meta-narrative emerges, one which is in rebellion to the fan fantasy, one which regards the fan fantasy with contempt and disgust, and rather than creating his own movie that just was better than Force Awakens, Rian Johnson instead decided to make the narrative of the movie specifically about how bad The Force Awakens was and how he didn't like what J.J. Abrams did. So all of the things that J.J. Abrams set up, which are very kind of fan fiction-y, fan fantasy. Who are Rey's parents? Well, of course, later on he wants to reveal that Rey's parents are someone important because that's part of the fantasy. Instead, Ryan says that they're nobody. When Rey hands a lightsaber to Luke, Luke throws it over his shoulder, thus saying that it was stupid to think that this lightsaber was special. All of the ideas that are present in The Force Awakens get crapped on by Rian Johnson. I've made some content about that. So we have this rebellion in the dream. The dream is disturbed. So rather than Rey and Finn acting as the inserts for the author, rather than them being the dreamers, Luke Skywalker really represents the dreamer, Rian Johnson, in this one. And so through Luke Skywalker, we have Rian Johnson speak on a number of things. He speaks and ridicules the entire movie that came beforehand. He ridicules the idea of lightsabers being important. He ridicules the idea of good and bad. He ridicules the idea of the Jedi. He ridicules the idea of rebuilding a Jedi Order. He ridicules the entire set of ideas that the fan is experiencing euphorically. It's a true attempt at inversion of those, not just inversion of those ideas, but nihilistically destroying those ideas. But the author inserts are continually humiliated in this rebellion. So all of the new characters that are created, each one is systematically humiliated, either through direct physical humiliation, like Finn with the water squirting everywhere in the Bacta tank, which is just a set piece from The Empire Strikes Back, or Poe getting dressed down and demoted for trying to act heroically the way Luke did at the beginning of Empire Strikes Back, or it's Luke simply being himself and acting humiliated. That's how Rian Johnson probably felt. I mentioned it was kind of like Thomas Covenant. So through him, we have a lot of mouthpieces, and likewise, we have Kylo get completely humiliated and laid low as some sort of villain. And Rian Johnson acknowledges that Kylo Ren is just an insert for Darth Vader. He says, "You're no Darth Vader," and so the disturbance of the dream is the acknowledgement that you're engaging in a fan fantasy. But the movie doesn't really stop doing that. It persists through it, and only by kind of giving in to the narrative is Luke Skywalker, Rian Johnson's insert, able to free himself. He's only able to free himself by giving up on trying to rebel and then actually doing something that saves some people's lives, and then he's finally able to join the Force and be free of the torment of being in a Star Wars movie. It's kind of how I viewed it. Then, of course, authorship passes back to the original dreamer, but things are in a state of chaos. They've been having nightmares, and trying to reconstruct their fantasy from the nightmares seems impossible. This is why the beginning of Return of Skywalker is such a jumbled up mess of images and exposition. The dreamer is trying to reconstruct what his fantasy was. He's trying to get back to fantasizing about Return of the Jedi and going in and finally killing the Emperor, and so that's what the movie ends up being about. You go through all the set pieces, things finally get reconstructed. Leia, you have Leia loving on Rey and mentoring her, and you finally have all of the things that you were trying to accomplish in your fan fantasy with your author inserts finally come about. Everybody gets to be the hero at the end. Everybody has the Force. Finn has the Force. Poe's a hero, which is what the fan wanted in the beginning. That's what the dreamer wanted. And we get to the final confrontation. This is another way that it's kind of an author insert. Not only is Rey able to get to the replication of Return of the Jedi facing Emperor Palpatine, but the resolution happens, again, differently. It happens without assistance. In Return of the Jedi, Luke could not kill the Emperor. He simply didn't have enough power, and I think he recognized that. And by refusing to fight the Emperor, he was sticking more to his belief in principles, his belief in his father, his belief in his own goodness, and his refusal to act in the way that the Emperor wanted him to act. And through that selfless act, through that self-sacrifice, Darth Vader turns on his master and kills Palpatine. So Luke Skywalker as a hero doesn't commit the final heroic act. His heroic act is to convince the truly powerful character, which is Darth Vader, to destroy his master for him. Not intentionally, but that's the way it pans out. So we don't have that with the destruction of Palpatine. With the destruction of Palpatine, we have the entire thing accomplished through Rey herself. And in fact, Kylo is almost superfluous to the ending. You could have cut him out of the ending and cut out that little force heal part, and it would have been absolutely fine. In fact, there's actually another little layer to that. But so she pulls out a lightsaber and blocks the force lightning, and we've seen that before with Mace Windu doing that to the Emperor, back in episode 3. But she pulls out 2 lightsabers, and it's like that's the difference. And so she blows up the Emperor with those 2 lightsabers. She blows him up herself. There's no requirement for another character to come in and sacrifice himself, another character to come in and complete that necessary final step. This is something that is very much in line with what happens in Force Awakens. You have the same plot points, but they are resolved entirely by the author insert character. They're resolved by the Mary Sue. And then Kylo comes crawling out of the abyss to then heal her after she's died. So this is part of the fan fantasy as well, is that they are imagining that they've done something very selfless and heroic, and they have sacrificed themselves to end the Emperor. But it's no fun imagining your fantasy of you being dead. So instead, Kylo Ren comes out and he sacrifices his life force by pumping it into Rey to wake her up and to bring her back so that the author can have the conclusion that he wants. So the Darth Vader character, rather than sacrificing himself to kill the Emperor, sacrifices himself to bring the Mary Sue character back to life. It's all quite dreamlike and quite strange by the time you get to that third act. Everything is out of the windows. Not only do you have Death Stars in that last act, you have a fleet of Death Stars. And then, of course, at the end of the movie, so the stakes are higher than they ever were in the original trilogy, and that's the point. It's like it's bigger and better, and I'm more powerful than those original characters. That's the fantasy. Then when you finally get to the end, you have the ghosts of the characters that you love. You have the ghosts of the heroes appear and bless you and anoint you. And Rey takes on the name of Skywalker. She says, "Oh, my name is Rey Skywalker." And that completes the cycle, because not only has she experienced the original trilogy, not only has she experienced the movies directly, she's at the end taken on the literal identity of the hero. So it's like she is the hero. She's the descendant of the hero. She's the inheritor of the hero, while, of course, having been better than the hero pretty much the whole way through the story. So that's what we see as this meta-narrative, and it's kind of interesting. At the end of the day, it's about 2 directors quibbling over what their movies should be, but the end result is a very, very farcical fan fantasy that is disturbed in the middle of it in a way that I think is really unique. I think it's far more interesting than the execution of the movies themselves, which is really a mess. There's no coherency between them. But that lack of coherency adds to that dreamlike effect. There's no real common thread. There's no real sense to it. It feels like you're wandering through a dream, and it gets more chaotic as you go, and it speeds up until you're finally doing what you want to do, and you finally have this placid resolution and completion of the fan fantasy. It's very, very interesting in those regards. So that's kind of what I thought about it. I call it the fan fantasy dream cycle, right? It's a dream cycle of a fan's fantasy of being in the movies themselves. That's what came out of all of that money and all of that effort from Disney, is something that is profoundly strange and really doesn't add anything. In fact, detracts from the ability of the setting to act as a coherent whole. Very interesting. So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below on this. Let me know what you want to see and what you want to hear in the future as we move past Star Wars a little bit. Newest fantasy book's called City of Silver. Newest other book, this is a horror book called Eyes in the Walls. This one came out a little bit over a week ago. 99 cents. Both of these are 99-cent ebooks, and so you can grab those. Paperback's a little bit more. And of course, the Fantasy Christmas Spectacular will be around for another week or so before it goes away. This is 10 of my books. It actually includes City of Silver in it. So you can get a large number of books by getting this one book right here. It's $20.19 for the paperback, or $9.99 for the ebook. So Thanks so much, and I'll see you all next time.